Alright, following up from the previous video, what I'm gonna do is create a reference image. That reference image is gonna be helpful for me to determine what is gonna be the actual shape of my model. The best way of creating a reference image would be going to View and create Image Plane. Now there is an issue for me if I try to create that in the perspective, and I'm gonna exemplify that. When I create that reference image, and I'm gonna start with the pawn from this perspective, take a look at what happened with my image plane. That thing is completely constrained to what my camera system is, and therefore from this particular angle is completely useless to me. So what I'm going to do is undo that change and first of all change to the front view. I'm going to go to my view, image plane, import image, and then I'm gonna select my pawn. As this image was tweaked in Photoshop, I'm able to just use it on the side reference as well. Although for shapes that are so simple like this and are basically based around a cylinder, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to have a reference image on the side. But for the sake of completion, I'm just gonna keep both of them like this. After I select one of them, I'm just gonna get it out of the way. And as this is working on an orthographic view, as you can see, there's really not a lot of problems moving in one place or the other. The next thing that I'm going to do is just create a new layer base for these images. I'm gonna go to my channel box, layer editor, and I'm gonna say, having both of these objects selected, I'm just gonna create a new layer. I'm gonna call this layer reference layer, and I'm just gonna assign a color onto it. Now I can enable and disable them at will, and that is going to allow for a really good workflow. Alright, the next step is going to be generate a cylinder. Now, as I'm gonna try to make this as low polygon as possible, I'm gonna start with my subdivisions at 12. That way, whenever I cut on some faces, the number is actually reduced. For actually displaying this information on the side, I'm going to go to my display, heads of display, and poly count. Again, I can enable and disable this by going to display, heads of display, poly count. My poly count right now is 48, and if I had my original 20 subdivisions, this is what it's gonna look like. So triangles 80, triangles 48. Now this might be like, or seems like a little gain on what I'm doing, but at the end of the day, if I insert more geometry onto this following a loop, the gain should be more evident. This is base of 72 triangles versus this shape that is 120. So as you can see, poly reducing the count at the beginning of my shape is super useful. Now you might be thinking, there is really faceted, and I see a lot of these hard edges that are just breaking the illusion of having an object roundish. Well, that is just a matter of selecting these edges and then going to my mesh display, going to my soften edge. Looking them from the side doesn't really generate a lot of difference now, does it? The issue really comes on the top face, that you can really see hard edges on this side. But if our asset is gonna be like this big, it doesn't really make a lot of difference having it one way or another. So I'm just gonna take this one out, and I'm gonna conserve the one that I had with 12 subdivisions. The next step for me is going to be start actually carving out the pieces out of it. Now, whenever I scale, having the pivot point is important. If I have it right at the center, it's going to be scaling it up all the way in. And I may not want that effect, especially if I want to be scaling in this particular plane, for instance. So something that is going to be really useful for me right now is move the pivot point down to this vertex. So by selecting the object and going to my selection mode, if I hold D and then hold X, that's going to let me snap to the grid. Now it's moving in all these particular pieces, but that's not really exactly what I want. What I want to have is this thing completely stuck onto this shape. Well, if I hold D and V as in Victor, I can just move it up, and then I can start moving my shape from that position. Again, holding X without holding D this time, I can just align it with my reference image on the back. What I'm going to do now is scale it up in such a way that is partially covering my shape, but completely covering in the width. Modeling like this is really complicated because I don't really have a frame of reference that I can see or see through, and that completely defeats the purpose of this. Now for this, what I'm going to do is create a new material, and this is going to be a simple Lambert material. I'm gonna go to the top of my new created material, and I'm just going to rename this modeling underscore M for material. Something that I like to do as well is change the shading group name, so that is going to be the modeling underscore shading group. I will assign a color that is really contrasting with the green that I have out there, and red is a great reference for that. I'm also gonna make it semi-transparent so I can see through the object, and voila, at this point I have a frame of reference that is working for me. I'm gonna start with the base, so what I'm gonna do is just move these in such a way that is covering this part. What I will do now is go to my vertex selection and just move these vertices down. My widget is kind of large, and at this point it's getting in my way, so what I'm gonna proceed to do is just press minus on my keyboard, and that's gonna reduce the size of this. I'm gonna move it down to a point in which is gonna have a fluctuation in the angle. So over here I'm just gonna scale this thing up, move it up a bit, and that seems to be good enough. Now the next thing that I'm going to do is extrude the faces that I have on the top. For that sort of extrusion, what I really need to have selected is the faces. And the issue with this shape though is that if I try to do the quick selection, like double clicking the next one by holding X, like I would do on the side, that doesn't really work, and that is the way the construction on triangles on the top. So instead of doing it like this, what I'm gonna do is just a quick marquee selection on the side and deselect from the same shape underneath. That's gonna leave my shapes on this top selected. The next thing that I'm gonna do is start extruding my way out. I'm gonna go to my mesh, extrude, and I'm just going to be pulling this thing up and scaling it down. If I was to go to my mesh extrude every single time that I want to create more faces, that would just take forever. So I have a shortcut, the letter G, is going to help me out just duplicate or replicate the last action that I just did. So in this case I can start making this thing up, pressing G one more time, I can start scaling it down. The shortcut for extrusion, on the other hand, is Ctrl E. So whether pressing Ctrl E or just G, as that, if that's your last repeated action, is gonna improve your workflow really, really fast. So I'm gonna scale this thing up, and I'm gonna continue the extrusion until I get up to this point. Just take in consideration all the fluctuation points. that is basically where you should start dividing your shape. So I'm gonna continue going up, and I'm skipping this fluctuation over here. So I'm gonna fix that in a minute to show a different concept. But my shape basically looks this way. That is a general profile that I'm trying to fulfill with this. Alright, now for actually making this thing round, depending on what the level of detail you want for your shape, you may just leave it like this or continue working your way and making more extrusions. The other thing that I can do is just simply insert two basic edge loops. So in mesh tool, insert edge loop, and scale them down in such a way that is generating this nice round shape for me. The issue with that, of course, is that I basically just added 12 more quads or 24 more triangles to make it, look rounder. And if you're going to be looking at this object from this far, it doesn't really give that much information. But for now, I'm just going to keep those faces, and maybe I'm going to poly reduce this shape later. So far, I have 384 triangles, which is really not a terrible thing. But at the same time, I feel like this is really high poly for what I really need. The easiest way to generate this shape is not creating more extrusions and going all the way around, but rather just generate a new sphere and have it appended on the top. I'm gonna assign the same modeling material onto this shape. That's in assign existing material, modeling material, and I'm gonna just move it down to where I calculate the center to be. So scaling it down, you can see that both shapes are going to meet in this point. From here, I am really interested in that both of these shapes have the same number of subdivision horizontally, and that is because I want to try to merge both of these shapes. So what I'm going to do is actually modify the properties of my circle. Over here on my sphere, in order to make it roundish, I will just have to modify this thing to 12. So even 12 looks good enough for what I'm trying to do over here. Now, these two pieces are meant to merge. If I go to my reference image, I can tell that there is some new faces that are appending here. The first thing that I need to do is get rid of the faces that are right in my way. So I'm gonna go to my face selection mode. I'm gonna go to the side and I'm gonna do a marquee selection on this shape, and I'm gonna get rid of this. I'm gonna select the second one. I'm gonna go to my face selection, select these top faces, but deselects the ones that are going up, and you can see the ones that are here on the side. Now with this, I have two separate objects, and the next step that I'm going to do is just go to my mesh, combine. That is gonna generate a single object, and it's gonna lose a lot of the history that it has. This is a great point of saving my work, so I'm just gonna go to my file, save scene as, and I'm gonna save this as a Maya binary under the scene folder. This is going to be called point, and I'm gonna save this thing. Now that I have these two pieces together, look at what happens if I actually start increasing or decreasing the geometry on this shape. The whole thing completely breaks down, and that has to do with the history that this object has allocated. At this point, there is really no way that I can just go back and start modifying the number of subdivisions that I have. That's why it's crucial to just modify these things at the beginning. Next tool is I have many different options here. One of them could be selecting the vertices and then just snapping them one by one to the actual position that I am interested in having them. Oops, there you go. And then going by one, which can be a little messy and at the same time can take forever. But that will complete the shape here. The other option that I have is the append to polygon tool. So mesh, append to polygon, and I can just click on this edge and this edge. That's gonna generate this face for me, and I can press G and keep on working my way around the whole object. Oops, let me destroy this thing. G here, there, and there. But again, that's gonna require a lot of time. So what I'm gonna do now, instead of working my way through that, is just selecting this edge and selecting this other edge loop. And what I'm gonna do is go to my bridge tool. I lost my bridge tool for a moment. The thing that I need to be aware of that is if I don't change the number of subdivisions, this is just gonna generate an insane amount of geometry. So I'm just gonna keep it to 0. And that basically connected both of my shapes. This is a great time to delete the history of my object, so I'm just gonna go to edit, delete by type history. And that is just gonna generate this shape. If I go to my profile, I can see that this is just completely out of proportion. So what I will do is select this edge and just scale it up. That way it's just gonna fit this profile that I have. Oops, double click, that's important. And that is it. Now the other edges that I modified on the top are faceted, and that is because the normals were modified on that. So I'm gonna go back to my Lambert one, and you can see the difference between these guys on the side and this one on the top. I'm gonna select these edges on the side and the ones on the top, and again I'm gonna go to my mesh display, soften edge. Very faceted as well in here. So I'm gonna do this face selection, and then I will change my selection by holding Ctrl to edges, and then to contain edges. Then I'm gonna go to my edit mesh display and soften edge. Looks way better. I'm also not happy with this edge over here, but it seems to be just this one. I'm gonna select these and go to my mesh display, soften edge. And at this point it's just a matter of reviewing my geometry. This is somewhat high polygonal, 648 faces for just a piece of geometry that is gonna be looked from this far away, if we are lucky enough, is really high, and thus I will need to reduce it a lot more. But in the meantime, that looks round enough, and I think that would conclude the first tutorial. I will need to clean up my geometry, that or my history that goes with Alt Shift D, and as well I'm going to modify and freeze my transformations. I haven't really modified any transformations out of this object, but that is always a great practice. So delete the history and freeze the transformations. I'm also going to name this pawn, and that is the name of my object transform really. So if I check the shape is going to be named different. The transform itself is going to be called pawn, but the transform mesh is going to be called shape, or it's going to have this shape appended. I am not creating any materials for now, but again, that concludes the lesson, and that is just a general review on how to start building this pawn. I'm going to continue using these bases in the following videos.